I'm going to go over these sentences, but they're going to be put into an ed puzzle. I'm going to break down the words, definitions, I'm going to tell you the forms, I'm going to put it all together. Then there's going to pause on this ed puzzle that you will complete, and you will have to translate the sentence. Doesn't matter if you get the sentence right or wrong. By you doing it, at least if it looks as though it's authentic, you're going to get full credit for it and receive the 100. In the hopes that obviously then after the implementation or the input of your sentence translation, I will obviously translate the sentence. So, in these sentences, you're going to find that they are chock full of participles, and they are chock full of gerunds and gerundives. And hopefully you will have already watched the gerunds and gerundive video, and obviously known and seen how they function, what they look like, you look for the ND, etc. So, let's look at sentence number 1. Aurelia, obviously, here is my subject, and so I will underline the main clause in blue, but if I were to do that, I would underline the whole thing. But what you do see is a comma, and then inside the comma, you will find 2 participles. One is wokans, which you know is a present active participle that comes from the verb wokare, meaning to call. So that is obviously, because of its form, nominative, modifying Aurelia, telling us what kind of Aurelia. Then we have Corneliam as our direct object of wokans, and so it is modified by cursuram, which of course comes from the verb currere, which of course means to run. And here, obviously, the atrium is just the main room of the house. So, hopefully you can piece that together. And it is obviously here modifying Corneliam, telling us what kind of Cornelia, the Cornelia. Now, we then can move along in urbum glirium emendorum causa. Hopefully you'll recognize emendorum as a gerund or gerundive. Look at the ending. Remember that gerunds have to have either the ending genitive I, or dative O, or accusative UM, or ablative O. It does not have any of those, so it must be a gerundive, and is doing what a gerundive does. Gerundives modify. And so therefore, it's modifying glirium, which, remember, from the first chapter of the second book, chapter 28, is dormouse, or a dormice. A dormice. And note that it is followed by causa. Remember that causa and gratia, when they are working with a gerund and or gerundive phrase, means for the sake of. Or for the purpose of. Then we move along. You should know obviously what serves are. This is your ablative of personal agent. Remember that when you have a passive verb, and we certainly have a passive verb here, that the agent is telling you by whom is the action committed. So Aurelia, portabitur. Note the bi, and this is from the verb that means, of course, to carry. Porto, portare. Celeriter is merely an adverb telling us how an action. Ambulare, you should simply know, of course, from chapter 2, walk, and it is, of course, the infinitive. And then, of course, usis comes from the verb ubeo, ubere, usi, usus, and it is the verb that is going to mean to order. Here it is a perfect passive participle. Now remember, participles do one thing. They modify. And it is modifying series. And so in this way, it tells us by what kind of slaves. So, I would translate in the following way. Aurelia, the one. Aurelia, causa, and Aurelia, the ones. And lastly, so you'll know about emendorum, this is from the verb emere, which means to buy. Now you will translate it. Now that you have finished your translation, let's see if you have it correct. Aurelia, the one calling, present active participle. Cornelia, about to run. So it's which Cornelia, the one Aurelia calling? Calling the Cornelia about to run to the atrium. That Aurelia will be carried into the city, in plus accusative, into, for the sake of dormice about to be bought. And she will be carried by slaves, the ones having been ordered to walk quickly. Now, it's at this time I'll probably make you do something else. And that is, not on this one, but in the future, I will ask you to turn this gerundive phrase into a gerund. The way by which you are going to do that is that right now, glirium is the genitive object of causa. And so it is for the sake of the dormice. But now we want to say, not for the sake of the dormice, but for the sake of buying an act. And so we want to change emendorum into the gerund. And remember, it has to have one of those forms. As the gerund, it will be the object of causa. And so we will put, because causa requires a genitive object, and now we understand that a gerund does not modify, but rather has a direct object of buying what? Dormice. And so since this is a third declension, and I know it's third declension because I see the third declension genitive plural ending, I will put the third declension accusative. So in the blue, it says, for the sake of buying dormice. In the black, it says, for the sake of the dormice about to be bought. Essentially, they mean the same thing idiomatically, but there's that small difference. All right, we're moving on then now to the second one, and we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to walk you through it, and then you're going to provide your translation. So, for number 2, Raida obviously is a minivan. If you would like to call it a carriage, that's perfectly fine. But minivan it is. And Corneliorum obviously is genitive, telling you whose. So we all know how to translate genitives. Now, this is where it's going to get incredibly difficult. And I fully admit it, and I might actually walk you through it a little bit more closely. So that carriage, Corneliorum, and then here we have, if we're going to skip this odd mandatum pricamum parendum, the reason I'm going to skip it for now is that obviously this is a gerund or gerundive phrase. And it is from the verb parere. Now remember, there are certain verbs that are going to require, instead of an accusative object, a dative object. And so it is one of those that requires a dative. So if I were to say that I love my mom, the only kind of mom that I can love is, of course, an accusative mom, my trim. But if I were to say I obey, the only kind of mom that I can obey is a dative mom. Normally objects are accusative, but there are certain verbs because of the meaning. Because when you obey somebody, you are giving obedience to them. So, the carriage. Then odd plus a gerund or gerundive phrase indicates purpose. Remember, it is now going to be translated for the purpose of or for the sake of. But we're going to skip it for now. Iter facientium. Now when I look at facientium, which comes from, obviously, facio facere, it is a present active participle, and it's modifying the Cornelians. So it tells us what kind of Cornelians. The Cornelians. Now, then this tells us, perhaps, the purpose of the minivan and the Cornelians and all sorts of things like that. Now, I'm going to go ahead and tell you how this is, because it is so difficult. For the purpose of an order, and it's the order of the emperor about to be obeyed. It is a gerundive, modifying mandatum. Now, in a normal world, actually, it could be either. Because in a normal world, if I would turn it from the gerundive that it is into a gerund, it would be ad mandatum. tum parendum. Because as a gerund, it would be for the sake of obeying the command. But, and this is where it gets super tricky, because parere would have a dative object, if it were a gerund and had an object, that object would have to be in the dative case. Incredibly difficult. So that's why I'm giving you the outright answer, at least for that part. So it's going to say, for the sake of the order, for the purpose of the order of the emperor, it's the emperor's order about to be obeyed. But I'll continue on. So the Rida Corneliorum, the Corneliorum facientium iter ad mandatum parendum, and it's mandatum principis parendum. That Rida, and I need to go find out the verb for which that is the subject. And I find it with tracta est. Tracta est is, of course, the verb that means traho trahere, to drag or pull. A fossa, this is a ditch. Auxilio equorum. Auxilio here is in the ablative case. By with, because of from and on at, and it is the word for help. Obviously, equorum, horses. The calponis. Now, a calpona is an inn, but a calpo is an innkeeper. First declension, third declension. Third declension, short is. It's the innkeeper. The horse is genitive, and it is the innkeeper, conducti. A perfect passive participle telling you what kind of innkeeper. And this is the verb conduco, conducere, conduxi, conductus, meaning to hire. So again, the Rida Corneliorum, the ones facientium iter, and remember that this is a journey, it is accusative, and it is the object of facientium, ad mandatum principis parendum, that Rida tracta est, e fossa, auxilio equorum, calponus conducti. You translate. So to put it all together, it says, the carriage of the Cornelians, the ones making a journey for the sake of the order of the emperor about to be obeyed, that minivan has been dragged, was dragged, when you pair the present of the verb to be with the perfect passive participle, it creates a perfect passive verb. Has been dragged, was dragged out of the ditch with the help of the horses of the innkeeper. Moving on to number 3. Bona a in colis. So bona is from the adjective bonus, bona, bonum, but here we have substantized it to make it the noun bonum, boni, a second declension neuter noun, and so it is substantized meaning goods. It is nominative, and it is the verb of servata erat, which is from the verb servare, which means to save. Now, here we have the imperfect of the verb to be paired with the perfect passive participle. So together as a unit, because you do not see servata, you do not see errant, you see servata errant, it is a pluperfect verb. So, us bona, servata errant. This is your ablative of personal agent. If I say dinner was burned last night, you want to know by whom? By me. I actually did burn it. Nevertheless, here the in colis is from in cola, in coli, it's an inhabitant. So, the bona, servata erat, a in colis. Here is the apartment building, and it's in the genitive. And here, as we move along, we see both delendai and ponendo. Now this is very difficult, but we recognize both of them as being either a gerund or a gerundive. This is from deleo delere, which means to destroy, and I see that it is in the genitive singular, so it is modifying insulae. And then flamis here is your ablative that is showing the means of the act delendai. Now when I look at ponendo, which comes from pono ponere, which of course means to put or to place, it, however, is not modifying anything, so it must be a gerund. Now remember, gerundives are passive and translated about to be verbed. Or if you would like, you leave out the about and just say to be verbed. But gerunds, on the other hand, is the act itself verbing. Ponendo, this is your accusative plural neuter object of ponendo, and it is referring to the bona. Ponendo ea in via. That is how that bona stuff servate erat. So, the bona servate erat a in colis. The a in colis, insulae, the insulae delendai flamis, and that stuff servate erant ponendo ea in via. You will translate. It says, the goods had been saved by the inhabitants of the apartment building. The apartment building, the one about to be destroyed by flames. And those goods had been saved by the act of placing them in the street. So therefore they didn't go up in flames. All right, the next sentence, which is also a part of number 3. Liberi, the free ones, literally, the word for children. And simul means at the same time. So liberi, children. Simul at the same time. I'm moving along, all of a sudden I find a gerund and or a gerundive. Inveniendai. Now remember, inveniendai is, when I look at it, gotta be a gerundive. How do I know automatically? It's not one of the 4 gerund forms. Remember, the 4 gerund forms would have genitive, second declension neuter, long I, dative, second declension neuter, long O, accusative, second declension neuter, um, or an ablative, second declension neuter, long O. And so it says, the children, simul, and here we have gratia, which, remember, when it is with a gerund or gerundive phrase, is going to mean for the sake of. Since this is a gerundive, it must be modifying something, and lo and behold it is. Genitive singular, that's third declension. Genitive singular, they're both, of course, feminine. Auxilio clamavere. Now when I look, and I already know from the previous sentence that this means help, clamavere looks as though it could be an infinitive, but it is not. How do I know? I look at the perfect stem. And so they, the children, they clamavered. And then this, I will go ahead and tell you, is dative. And remember, datives are translated to or for. I would go with the second one, for. Et, so not only the liberi clamavere, but also the liberi servandi erunt. Now, again, this is a gerundive, but it is hanging out with the form of the verb to be, which makes it a future passive periphrastic. And remember, the future passive periphrastics imply obligation. And so, they, tomorrow, make it passive and make it obligatory. Now, also about a future passive periphrastic, normally, if I were to write something like this, he or she or it is loved, and I were to say a puella, as we have been seeing, normally your agency is shown with an ablative of agent. But if I were to have a future passive paraphrastic dative of agent, it will have a dative of agent, which means that here it would just be puellae as the dative form. Likewise here, ad statibus is your dative of agent. He is loved by the girl. She, and I know it's she because of Amanda, so I want to make it a he. I can change that to Amandus. He must be loved by the girl. Normally datives are translated to or for, but when they're showing the agency, it's by. So, liberi. At that same time, the liberi, they clamavereid auxilio, and they did so, gratia matris inveniendae. And the liberi servandierunt, obligatory, obligation, tomorrow, ad statibus. Best you can with your translation. Now, the children, at the same time, they shouted for help for the sake of their mother about to be found. We would say for the sake of finding their mom, they shouted for help. But that's the way the Romans would say it. And they, in the future, will have to be saved by the bystanders. Now, I'm going to pause it at this time and see if you can, in your best efforts, change this gerundive phrase into a gerund. What you're going to have to do is not make matris the object genitive of gratia, but you must make this a gerund and as the object, because we do not want to say for the sake of the mother about to be found. We want to say for the sake of finding. The sake of finding, and finding what? Finding the mom. So you would have to take mom and make it the accusative direct object of your gerund. So, take that, turn it into a gerund, pick one of the forms, it's going to be the object of gratia in the genitive, and then make that the direct object. Okay, now, let's see if you've done so correctly. Gratia, and then this is going to be in D, because it's now the object of gratia, and this then becomes the object accusative of the gerund in D. So in the blue it says, for the sake of finding the mom, and in the black it says, for the sake of the mother about to be found. This black word is genitive because it is modifying matris, which is genitive, object of gratia. But the blue word in D is genitive because it is the object of gratia, and then matrim is the accusative direct object of D. One more that you will be walked through and then provide your own translation. And that will be the last one of this video. Lupus amarco ramo statum repiendo ad puella servandas repulsus erit. So for this one it says, the lupus, which is a wolf, obviously our subject, repulsus erit, which of course means to drive off. Now, repella, repellere, to drive off. But note that it is the future of the verb to be, ero, eris, erit, paired with the perfect passive participle, so it's going to create a future perfect verb. And here again we see, when it is a passive verb, the ablative of personal agent. Dinner was burned last night by Mr. Adams. Lupus repulsus erit a Marco. Now, ramo is of course a branch. Statum means immediately. And repiendo, which comes from repio, repere, which means to grab. It is either a gerund or a gerundive. We've got to figure out which one. Well, conveniently, modifies ramo. And so that ramo is modified by arrepiendo, making this a gerundive. Now it has one of the forms a gerund could be, but it is doing what gerundives do, they modify. So what kind of ramo? An arrepiendo ramo. And of course, like I said, this means to grab. And then here we have ad puellas servandas, another gerund or gerundive, and we can easily see which one it is because it is not one of the 4 gerund forms. Gerund forms can only be those 4 endings. And so here, it is telling us the girls, and remember with ad, it is going to take, with a gerund gerundive, the meaning of for the purpose of. So, I could put a period right here and have a whole sentence. And so, it's pause and you'll translate it. Let me walk you through it. Lupus reposa sere a Marco. A Marco ramo statum arrepiendo. And why lupus reposa seret? Ad puellas servandas. So it says, the wolf will have been driven off. Will have is the expression of future perfect and it's passive, so been. Driven off by Marcus with a branch immediately about to be grabbed. And why will that wolf have been driven off? For the purpose of the girls about to be saved. Now, we could understand it as for the purpose of saving the girls. And so what I want you to do is take this phrase and make it a gerund phrase. Not a gerundive, a gerund phrase. Gerund. Now, remember, a gerund can only have one of these 4 forms. And it's going to say not for the sake of the girls, but for the sake of saving. So the sake of saving is going to be the object of the ad. It only can be one of those 4 forms. And remember, ad has to take an accusative object. And then puellas is then going to become the accusative direct object of that gerund. So this is what you should have put. Ad servandum for the purpose of saving. And then puellas remains puellas because it's now the accusative direct object. So the blue says for the purpose of saving the girls, and the black says for the purpose of the girls about to be saved. Now, this is accusative, and this is accusative, this is accusative, and this is accusative, but they, too, are accusative for different reasons. In the blue, it is accusative, puellas, because it is the direct object of the gerund servandum, whereas in the black, it is the accusative object of ad. Servandum in the blue is accusative because it is the object of ad, whereas servandas is accusative in the black because it is modifying puellas for the purpose of saving the girls, for the purpose of the girls about to be saved. Now, moving on, all of this will have been done antequam means before. Sextus is obviously our subject. Diligenter is merely an adverb that means diligently. Pedibus, that's the word for foot. Note its form in the dative or ablative. In ramis, that of course is a branch, but it is plural. And we end up with then ponendis. Now ponendis comes from pono, ponere, that means to put or place. It is a gerundive, so it must be modifying something. And what it is modifying is the pedibus. Ex arbore ascendit. So again, I'm going to stop at that clause. So, before sextus, ascendet. Ooh, that is an E. We must ask the question. Ascendere. It's a 3rd conjugation verb with an E as the vowel. So it's got to be one of the 2. Ask the question, long E. Is it 2nd conjugation, question mark? Is it 3rd conjugation, question mark? Present if it were 2nd, future if it's 3rd. So, before sextus ascendet, by pedibus, ponendis, diligenter in ramis. And ex arbre escendit. Sextus ex arbre escendit. Peribus diligenter ponendis in ramis. So hopefully what you put is, before Sextus will climb out of the tree by his feet about to be placed diligently on the branches. What would it be if you wanted to say by putting his feet on the branches? Ponendis would have to turn into by putting, by the act of putting, and it would have to be a gerund, and pedibus would then become the direct object. Remember its third declension. Do your best to try to render those two words, turning that into a gerund and that into the direct object of the gerund. You would have put the following: ponendo, by putting, of the act of putting, to or for the act of putting, putting, by, with, because of, from, in, on, at, putting. Genitive, dative, accusative, and adverb. By placing his feet, pedes, on the branches diligently, carefully. But it says in the original, in the black ink, by his feet about to be placed. Quod puer habet. Puer is our subject, and he habets a magnam timorim. This is a fear. And it is a fear lupi, genitive. Now here we see widendi, which is a gerund or a gerundive. Indi. And remember, gerunds are nouns, gerundives modify. Could this be modifying lupi? Indeed it is modifying lupi. So why will Sextus climb out? Quod puer habet. We have to ask the question. This is habere. And I see that it is a second conjugation. A magnam timorim lupi in the genitive. Which lupi? The one widendi iterum. Do your best. And it says, because the boy does hold, does have right now, in the present tense, a great fear, a huge fear of the wolf about to be seen again. The wolf to be seen again. Now we're going to try to turn this into a gerund phrase from its gerundive nature. To do so, we would have to make the wolf the direct object of the widendi, and it would not say a fear of the wolf about to be seen. It would be a fear of seeing the wolf. See if you can do it. Hopefully you put this down. Widendi does not change because now it is the gerund object of the fear of seeing. But wolf will change because it will become the direct object. Seeing what? Seeing the lupum. So it says in the black, he has a large fear of the wolf about to be seen again, and it's modifying lupi, whereas the one in blue says has a huge fear of seeing the wolf.